The neighborhood looked like the kind of place where nothing ever happened. Rows of identical houses stood shoulder to shoulder, each with manicured lawns cut to precisely 3 inches, trimmed hedges that never dared to wander, and fences painted in shades so neutral they almost blended into the pavement. It was the sort of development where conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. Every home was a box in a carefully arranged grid, and every yard was supposed to be a carbon copy of the next. But nestled on the corner of one street was a property that stood out, not because it was unkempt, not because it broke rules in a loud or garish way, but because it felt alive. Its grass was lush and thick, not cut into sharp lines, but rolling naturally in small waves of green. A few shade trees stretched tall at the back of the lot, their branches forming a canopy that welcomed breeze and birdsong. Wildflowers dotted the corners where bees and butterflies gathered, and a small stone pathway curved through the yard like an invitation rather than a statement. It was a lawn that wasn't about control, it was about life. For the homeowner, this yard was more than just a patch of grass. It was peace. It was weekends spent outdoors, mornings with coffee under the trees, and evenings watching the sky turn shades of orange and purple while the sound of crickets filled the air. It was freedom, a space where he didn't feel boxed into the rigid sameness that the rest of the community demanded. But in communities run by homeowners associations, peace rarely lasts. Because for every person who sees beauty in individuality, there's another who sees threat in deviation. And for this neighborhood, the HOA board saw that yard as a problem waiting to be corrected. It started with notes, those stiff, politely worded letters slipped into mailboxes that carried the weight of authority, but none of the warmth of actual neighborliness. They pointed out irregularities. The grass, though perfectly healthy, was described as inconsistent with community standards. The flowers, despite being native and eco-friendly, were labeled unsanctioned plantings. Even the stone pathway was accused of being non-compliant with the uniformity expectations of the block. The homeowner read these letters with disbelief at first. He had seen properties with dead grass, peeling fences, and garbage bins left out for days, none of which ever seemed to draw the same level of scrutiny. Yet somehow, his yard, a space alive, clean, and inviting, was suddenly an eyesore in their eyes. He suspected what most residents already whispered, that the HOA didn't really care about uniformity. What they cared about was control. As weeks passed, the pressure mounted. More letters arrived, this time with firmer wording. The language shifted from recommendations to requirements, and then from requirements to violations. With each new message, the tone hardened, as though the yard itself were a crime scene and the homeowner a repeat offender. Threats of fines followed. Then came the notice of a scheduled inspection, a thinly veiled attempt to intimidate him into compliance. For most residents, this was the point where they gave in. They conformed, they obeyed, and they sacrificed whatever individuality they had just to avoid becoming a target. But this homeowner was different. He wasn't careless, and he wasn't rebellious just for the sake of it. He simply believed that his yard was his own, that within the limits of reason he had the right to enjoy it as he pleased. The HOA could control paint colors and mailbox styles, but they had no right to strip life and joy from his property under the excuse of uniformity. The more they pushed, the more determined he became, and that determination would soon transform from quiet resistance into something the HOA had never anticipated. Because what the board didn't realize was that this yard wasn't just loved by its owner. It was loved by the neighborhood dogs. Every morning as the sun rose, neighbors walking their pets would slow down by the corner house. Dogs tugged at their leashes, tails wagging, noses sniffing the air. The yard seemed to call to them, a patch of soft grass, open space, and shade that promised relief from the sharp sidewalks and asphalt streets. When they passed by, the dogs would linger, sometimes lying down at the edge of the property as if they belonged there. Their owners would laugh, apologize, and pull them along, but the message was clear. The animals knew this space was special, and the homeowner noticed. One weekend, after yet another warning letter had landed in his mailbox, he sat in the yard and watched as a golden retriever pulled its owner to the corner, whining to stay just a little longer. Across the street, a small terrier hopped excitedly toward the flowers, while a shepherd mix stopped to paw at the grass, reluctant to leave. It was then that the seed of an idea took root, an idea that would not only protect his yard from the HOA's grip, but would turn their campaign of control into a spectacle they couldn't contain. The HOA wanted his yard. They wanted to strip it down, flatten it out, and make it bland enough to blend into their cookie-cutter vision of perfection. But what if, instead of losing it, he turned it into something bigger than himself, something no rule-book could erase? The idea lingered, grew and solidified. His yard would not be surrendered. Instead, it would be transformed. It wouldn't just be his personal haven anymore. It would be the neighborhood's dog park. At first, the concept seemed outrageous. Turning a private yard into a communal space wasn't exactly the norm in this kind of neighborhood, where property lines were sacred and the HOA dictated every inch of land. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. There were no parks nearby, no dedicated green spaces where dogs could run and play. The HOA had restricted everything down to decorations, but nowhere in their precious rulebook did it forbid welcoming others in. He began small, quietly setting the stage. A few extra water bowls placed near the porch, accessible to passing pups. A shaded bench near the trees where neighbors could sit for a moment. A section of grass trimmed just enough for dogs to run safely without fear of tripping. Word spread not through announcements, but through wagging tails and excited barks. One by one, the neighborhood dogs led their humans back to the yard, drawn to its freedom. The HOA noticed, of course. They always noticed. But at first, they underestimated him. They thought it was temporary, a phase, something that would fizzle out once he realized how much trouble it might bring. They didn't understand that this wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. This was strategy. This was transformation. As more neighbors began to gather, the yard changed. It became filled with laughter, with conversations sparked between people who had once lived like strangers behind identical fences. Children tossed balls to eager dogs. Retirees found joy in watching the animals play, and the air that had once been thick with HOA tension was now alive with community. And all the while, the board grew angrier. They had tried to pressure one man into surrendering his yard. Instead, they had created a movement. What they wanted to erase was now more visible than ever. What they called non-compliance had become the center of neighborhood life, and for every angry letter they sent, for every threat they issued, the response from the community was the same. More support for the yard, more dogs, more joy. The homeowner knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew the HOA wasn't going to let this go quietly, but he also knew something else. They had made a mistake. They had turned his yard into a battlefield, and in doing so, they had awakened something far stronger than their rulebooks. Neighbors united by the simple happiness of their pets. The HOA thought they could strip individuality from the block. Instead, they had planted the roots of defiance. And as the summer sun stretched long across the green, as paws pattered against the grass and tails wagged in the wind, the message became clear. This wasn't just a yard anymore. This was a park, a gathering place, a symbol. It was freedom, on 4 legs. And the HOA had no idea how much bigger the fight was about to get. The transformation of a single yard into a dog park had already sent ripples through the neighborhood. But by the following weeks, it became clear that the ripples were turning into waves. What had started as a small act of defiance against the HOA's attempt to seize control of a private property had blossomed into something much larger, an unspoken challenge to the authority of the board itself. The first signs of escalation appeared in the sheer number of visitors. At first, it was a handful of immediate neighbors who stopped by with their pets, quietly testing whether this unusual arrangement could hold. Within days, however, word spread beyond the immediate block. Families from streets over began arriving, guiding excitable dogs down the sidewalks and into the fenced-in space that now bore the unofficial nickname of the Freedom Yard. Soon cars began to line the streets, as visitors from outside the HOA boundaries came to see what the fuss was about. For the dogs, it was heaven. The lawn had been carefully maintained for years, and though the HOA had tried to control every blade of grass, the homeowner's meticulous care had made it lush, even resilient against wear. Toys, water bowls, and shaded benches had been set up around the perimeter. An obstacle course, donated by a neighbor who had kept old agility equipment in storage, gave the space a playful edge. The atmosphere was one of joy, laughter, and a sense of community that had been missing for far too long. For the HOA, however, the sight of this transformation was nothing short of infuriating. To them, the yard was not simply a patch of grass, but a symbol of power. By allowing it to become a gathering spot, the homeowner had effectively stripped the HOA of its authority over that corner of the neighborhood. It was a wound to their pride that they could not ignore, and the board members convened almost daily to discuss how to put a stop to it. Their first approach was to send written warnings, the same tactic they had used countless times before when policing mailbox colors, fence heights, or holiday decorations. Letters filled with legal-sounding language and stern demands began arriving in the homeowner's mailbox. They threatened fines, penalties, and even legal action if the yard was not restored to its original state. But this time, those letters had little effect. The homeowner, bolstered by growing community support, simply pinned each new notice to a corkboard set up near the entrance of the dog park. Visitors would stop and read them, shaking their heads or laughing at the absurdity of it all. The HOA's own warnings had become part of the attraction, serving as proof that the board was scrambling while the yard thrived. As the weeks passed, the situation escalated further. Local media caught wind of the story after a social media post showcasing the yard's transformation went viral. The images of dogs of all sizes running freely across the grass, with neighbors relaxing on benches and children laughing in the background, struck a chord with viewers. News outlets began to frame the story as a classic case of ordinary people standing up against overbearing bureaucracy. Interviews with visitors highlighted how rare it was to find a safe, open space for pets within the community. The HOA, meanwhile, found itself portrayed as the villain. Their rigid policies and obsession with control made them appear cold and unreasonable, especially when compared to the warmth and laughter radiating from the yard-turned-dog park. The board tried to push back, issuing statements about community standards and preserving property values, but their words fell flat in the face of widespread support for the homeowner. Tensions between the HOA and the residents began to boil over. Some board members, emboldened by their sense of authority, made attempts to physically confront the homeowner or visitors. They would march down the sidewalk with clipboards, snapping photos, and recording supposed violations. But each time they tried, they were met with crowds of neighbors who stood their ground, making it clear that the dog park was here to stay. This open defiance began to inspire others in the community. Residents who had long felt stifled by the HOA's endless list of rules began to realize they weren't powerless. They saw that the board's authority only held weight if people allowed themselves to be intimidated by it. Now, with one homeowner taking a stand and finding support, others started to push back as well. Suddenly, Halloween decorations stretched beyond the board's approved size. Holiday lights stayed up longer than permitted. Fences were painted brighter colors. The act of rebellion was contagious, spreading from yard to yard like wildfire. But for all the joy it brought to the community, the homeowner could feel the pressure building. The HOA was not backing down, and their threats grew increasingly severe. They began to hint at legal proceedings, claiming they could sue for damages or force the closure of the park through court orders. The board members even reached out to outside law firms in a desperate attempt to regain control. And yet, the homeowner knew something the board didn't. Behind the scenes, he had been documenting every interaction, every letter, and every confrontation. He kept meticulous records of how the HOA had overstepped, how their demands had contradicted their own bylaws, and how they had attempted to bully him into submission without proper legal standing. These records, combined with the mountain of public support and media attention, gave him leverage that the board could not counter easily. By the time spring rolled around, the dog park had become a permanent fixture of the neighborhood's identity. Weekly events, such as small dog meetups and training workshops, were organized by residents. Local businesses donated supplies, from bags of dog food to waste bins and even branded toys. A small sign was erected at the entrance, reading simply, "Community Dog Park, all are welcome." For the homeowner, it was deeply satisfying to see his lawn evolve from a contested piece of property into a beloved community hub. But beneath the smiles and wagging tails, he knew the HOA's fight was far from over. Their pride had been wounded too deeply, and their threats of escalation suggested they were preparing a final, desperate attempt to crush the rebellion once and for all. As the sun set on another lively weekend in the yard, with dogs chasing bulls and neighbors chatting happily, the homeowner stood quietly by the fence, watching. He could feel the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. The board had lost ground, but they weren't finished. Something was coming, something bigger, more aggressive, and potentially riskier than anything they had tried before. And so, while the community celebrated their small victory, the homeowner remained vigilant. The fight with the HOA wasn't just about a yard anymore. It was about freedom, about community, and about proving that one act of defiance could ignite a movement. The question was no longer whether the yard could survive. It was whether the people who had rallied around it were ready to face the full weight of the HOA's retaliation. And when it came, they would need to stand stronger than ever. The arrival of summer brought longer days, brighter skies, and even larger crowds to the dog park that had once been an ordinary suburban lawn. What had begun as one man's small act of rebellion against the HOA's attempt to seize control had turned into a gathering place for neighbors, friends, and even visitors from beyond the community. The laughter of children, the barking of dogs, and the hum of conversation created an atmosphere that no board meeting or threatening letter could erase. But beneath that cheerful surface, pressure was building. The HOA had suffered defeat after defeat, and their frustration reached a boiling point. They had issued fines, sent letters, called attorneys, and even attempted to intimidate visitors, but none of it had worked. Each attempt only seemed to strengthen the resolve of the community, uniting them further against the board's overreach. By July, the HOA president and his allies decided that if ordinary measures weren't enough, they would need to escalate. And escalate they did. The first sign came in the form of a lawsuit, hand-delivered by a process server. The HOA was suing the homeowner for violation of community standards, unauthorized use of property, and willful disregard of association bylaws. The document was thick with legal jargon, filled with claims that the dog park diminished property values and created liability risks. The homeowner had expected this. He had spent months preparing, documenting everything, and gathering evidence. He had also quietly consulted with attorneys of his own, many of whom were eager to take on a case that had already attracted media attention. By the time the HOA filed their suit, the homeowner's legal team was ready to respond, armed not only with counter-arguments, but also with evidence that the HOA itself had violated its own rules repeatedly in its attempts to intimidate him. The court proceedings became a spectacle. Local news covered each development, and neighbors showed up in droves to support the homeowner. Some even testified, explaining how the dog park had strengthened community bonds, improved mental health, and provided a safe place for families to gather. Experts were brought in to challenge the HOA's claims about property values, with real estate professionals testifying that the vibrant, welcoming atmosphere had actually made homes in the neighborhood more desirable. The HOA board members, once so confident in their authority, began to falter. Their attempts to paint the yard as a nuisance clashed with video footage of happy families and wagging tails. Their arguments about rules and regulations seemed hollow compared to the stories of how the park had brought joy to people's lives. Even the judge appeared skeptical of their case, questioning why the HOA had pursued such extreme measures instead of seeking compromise. But the board wasn't ready to surrender just yet. In a last-ditch effort to reclaim their authority, they attempted a direct intervention. One morning, residents woke to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling down the street. The HOA had hired contractors to dismantle the dog park, claiming they had emergency authorization to restore the yard to compliance. Trucks carrying tools and fencing materials lined the curb as workers prepared to move in. What the HOA hadn't anticipated was the response from the community. Word spread quickly, and within an hour, dozens of neighbors had gathered at the yard's entrance, forming a human barrier between the contractors and the park. Parents stood shoulder to shoulder with retirees, teenagers held handmade signs, and children clung to their dogs. The message was clear: The dog park wasn't just one homeowner's rebellion anymore, it belonged to the entire community. Faced with such resistance, the contractors hesitated. They weren't interested in becoming part of a neighborhood feud, especially one so visible. Within minutes, they packed up their equipment and left, refusing to proceed under such conditions. The HOA board, standing nearby in a cluster of suits and clipboards, could do nothing but watch as their final attempt collapsed. The standoff became the turning point. Within weeks, the court officially dismissed the HOA's lawsuit, citing a lack of merit and highlighting the board's failure to operate within its own bylaws. Not only was the homeowner free to keep the dog park, but the ruling also forced the HOA to pay a portion of the homeowner's legal fees, further embarrassing the board. The fallout was swift. Several board members resigned under pressure from the community, their reputations tarnished by the spectacle. The HOA president, once feared and unquestioned, found himself ostracized and powerless. In the months that followed, new elections were held, and a fresh slate of leaders, people who valued community over control, took charge. Their first official act was to update the bylaws, explicitly protecting the right for residents to use their property in ways that fostered community connection, provided safety, and promoted inclusivity. As for the dog park, it became more than just a symbol of defiance. It was formally recognized as a community space, with volunteers rotating responsibilities to keep it clean and welcoming. Local businesses continued to donate supplies, and seasonal events, from summer barbecues to holiday gatherings, turned the park into the heartbeat of the neighborhood. The homeowner, who had once stood alone against the HOA's threats, now found himself surrounded by gratitude and admiration. Neighbors often reminded him that without his courage, none of this would have been possible. He hadn't just defended his yard, he had reshaped the entire community, proving that rules meant to control could never outweigh the power of unity and joy. On a warm evening, months after the dust had settled, he stood at the edge of the park, watching as children played tag while their dogs darted happily across the grass. Wind chimes tinkled softly from porches, a reminder of other rebellions that had blossomed into tradition. The sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the scene, and he couldn't help but smile. The HOA had tried to take his yard. Instead, that yard had become something greater than anyone could have imagined. It had become a dog park, yes, but more than that, it had become proof that even in the most controlled environments, freedom, laughter, and community would always find a way to grow. And in the end, that was the real victory.